In the frozen kingdom of Kolyma, where the ground is hard as iron and the air snaps like a whip, a man is only worth as much as his hands can dig. If you can hold a shovel, you live. If you can push a wheelbarrow, you eat. But if you lose a limb, if the frostbite takes your toes or a rockfall crushes your leg, you usually become waste. You are sent to the invalid barracks, which is just a polite waiting room for the mass grave. But I didn't die. I lost my left leg below the knee during the winter of 1948, but I didn't die. I survived because I had a talent that the guards coveted more than gold. I was a carver. My name is Anatoly. Before the arrest, I restored icons in churches. In the camp, I carved chess pieces for the guards, cigarette holders for the officers, and combs for their wives. I worked with the bones of the dead, not human bones usually, but the walrus ivory and mammoth tusks that the miners sometimes pulled from the permafrost. The guards called me the magician. They gave me a corner in the tool shed near the stove. They gave me extra rations. And most importantly, they allowed me to craft my own leg. It wasn't a medical prosthetic. It was a piece of art born of desperation. I made it from the seasoned wood of a broken crate and reinforced it with a piece of dense, fossilized bone I stole from the workshop. It was heavy, it was clumsy, and it rubbed my stump raw with every step, but it allowed me to stand. And because I could stand, I could work. And because I could work, I became the keeper of secrets. You see, in the Gulag, the greatest enemy isn't the cold. It's the silence. The NKVD didn't just want to kill us, they wanted to erase us. When a man died in the mines, he didn't get a grave marker. He got a wooden tag tied to his ankle, and then he was thrown into a pit. His file was burned. His family was told he moved to a different camp. He ceased to exist. I watched this happen every day. I watched men I knew, professors, poets, fathers, disappear into the snow, leaving no trace behind. It drove me mad. I realized that if I died, their names would die with me. I needed a way to keep them. I needed paper, but paper was death. If a guard found a diary, you were shot. I needed something durable, something hidden. And then, one night, as I was polishing a piece of bone for a guard's knife handle, I looked down at my own artificial leg. I realized that the safest place to hide a secret was inside the one thing they would never take away from me. The plan began with a commission. It always starts with the vanity of evil men. The camp commandant, a man named Colonel Volkov, summoned me to his office. It was a warm room, smelling of tobacco and polished leather, scents that made my head spin after years of breathing coal dust and latrine fumes. On his desk sat a massive curved object. It was a mammoth tusk dug up from the gold mines by a brigade that had probably died retrieving it. It was brownish yellow, stained by thousands of years in the earth, but solid. Anatoly, the commandant said, running his hand over the ivory. The general's birthday is next month. I want a masterpiece. I want you to carve a scene of the glorious Soviet industry conquering the North. I want trains. I want factories. I want happy workers. He looked at me with his pale, watery eyes. If it is good, you get sugar and tea for a month. If it is bad, well, you don't need your other leg to feed the worms. I will make it beautiful, Citizen Chief, I promised. He gave me the tusk. He gave me a set of fine steel engraving tools, precious instruments that were strictly accounted for at the end of every shift, and he gave me permission to work alone in the shed at night. It was the perfect cover. I wasn't just working on the tusk. I began to collect the scraps. When you carve mammoth ivory or even beef bone from the kitchen soup, there are offcuts, small, flat slivers of bone that look like trash. I started collecting them. I would take a small, flat chip of bone, no bigger than a fingernail, and polish it until it was white and smooth. Then, using the finest needle from the engraving kit, I would start to write. I didn't write stories. I didn't have the space. I wrote data, name, year of birth, date of death, cause. I developed a microscopic shorthand, a series of scratches and dots that only I could read. Ivanov, A, 1905. Shot. Petrov, S, 1912. Typhus. Ginsburg, E, 1920. Frozen. I worked by the light of a flickering oil lamp, my eyes straining, my hand trembling with the fear of discovery. Every scratch was an act of rebellion. Every name was a victory against the erasure. But as the pile of bone chips grew, I faced a terrifying problem. Where could I put them? I couldn't leave them in the shed. The guards searched it weekly. I couldn't sew them into my clothes. The rags wore out or were stolen. I looked at my wooden leg leaning against the workbench. It was solid wood and bone, or so they thought. I picked up a drill. I knew what I had to do. I was going to turn my own limb into a library. The surgery on the leg had to be precise. If I weakened the structure too much, it would snap under my weight, and the crash would reveal everything. I waited until the camp was asleep, the only sound the wind howling through the barbed wire and the occasional cough from the barracks. I took my prosthetic leg and clamped it into the vise on my workbench. I chose a spot on the shin, the thickest part of the wood just below where the mammoth bone reinforcement began. I used a hand drill, grind, twist, pull. I had to be silent. I drilled a hole straight down into the core of the leg, about 6 inches deep. Then I widened it, carefully scraping out the insides until I had created a hollow cavity, a silo hidden within the timber. I fashioned a plug from a piece of matching wood, carving it so perfectly that when it was hammered in, the seam was invisible to the naked eye. To be sure, I rubbed dirt and grease over the joint to mimic the wear and tear of camp life. Now I had my vault. The next day, the loading began. I had 50 bone chips ready, 50 ghosts waiting to be interred. I wrapped them in a scrap of oilcloth to keep them from rattling. A rattling leg would be a death sentence during a silence. I slid the package into the hollow space. I sealed the plug. I strapped the leg back onto my stump. When I stood up, I felt a strange sensation. It wasn't just the physical weight of the leg, it was the metaphysical weight. I was literally walking on the dead. Every step I took, I was pressing the names of the murdered into the frozen earth. Thump, thump, thump. The sound of my walking changed for me. It became a rhythm of remembrance, but outside the shed, the horror continued. That afternoon, I watched a stage, a transport of prisoners, being prepared near the main gate. These weren't transfers. These were the exhausted ones, the men who could no longer meet the quota. They were being loaded onto trucks, told they were going to a sanatorium camp. We all knew the truth. They were going to the Serpentinka, the garage in the hills where tractor engines were revved to mask the sound of executions. I stood by the wire, watching them load. I saw a man I knew, a former teacher named Victor. He looked at me. He didn't wave. He just stared with hollow, dead eyes. He knew he was being erased. I gripped my carving tool in my pocket. I couldn't save Victor. I couldn't stop the truck. But as it drove away, disappearing into the white mist, I hobbled back to my shed. I took a fresh piece of bone, and I carved, Victor S. Teacher, 1949, taken. I put him in my leg. He was safe now. He was with me. The weeks blurred into a routine of terror and creation. By day, I was the loyal artisan, carving the glorious Soviet industry onto the commandant's tusk. I carved tiny, happy coal miners with smiles on their faces, a lie so grotesque it made my stomach turn. I carved trains that ran on time and factories that poured out smoke. The commandant would come in, inspect the work, and grunt his approval. Good detail, Anatoly, very patriotic. He didn't know that the dust covering the floor was the same dust covering the bones of the men he starved. By night, I carved the truth. The collection in my leg was growing. I had over 200 names now, but the work was becoming dangerous. I was running out of raw material. I couldn't keep asking for ivory. It would look suspicious. I had to improvise. I started visiting the camp kitchen's garbage pile. I dug through the frozen slop looking for animal bones, beef shins, pork ribs, anything hard enough to hold a scratch. I would boil them in a tin can on my stove to strip the fat, then bleach them in the sun. It was risky behavior. A prisoner digging in trash is normal. A prisoner boiling clean bones and cutting them into uniform squares is a saboteur. One evening, a guard named Sergeant Petrov walked in while I was preparing the chips. The smell of boiling bone filled the small shed. My heart hammered against my ribs. I had the official tusk on the table, but the illegal chips were drying next to the stove. Making soup, artist? Petrov sneered, kicking the door shut. Glue, Citizen Sergeant, I lied quickly. I need bone glue to seal the cracks in the general's tusk. The ivory is old. It's brittle. Petrov walked over to the stove. He picked up one of the small square chips. It was blank. I hadn't carved it yet. He turned it over in his thick, gloved fingers. Glue, huh? He looked at me, then at the tusk. Looks like mosaic tiles to me. You aren't making toys for yourself, are you? No, never, I stammered. It's for the base, to make it stable. He tossed the chip back into the pot. Finish the tusk. The general arrives in 3 weeks. If it's not done, you'll be making glue out of your own bones. He left. I sank onto my stool, shaking. It was too close. I realized I had to be faster. I couldn't leave blank chips lying around. I had to carve them immediately and hide them in the leg the same night. The margin for error was gone. I was working with a needle against a clock that was counting down to my execution. The friction began in the 3rd month. The hollow space inside my prosthetic was filled with hundreds of bone chips wrapped tightly in cloth. But the extra weight changed the balance of the leg. It swung differently. It hit the ground with a duller thud, and worse, the vibration of walking was causing the plug to loosen. I noticed it during the morning roll call. We were standing in the biting wind, rows of gray, shivering men. I shifted my weight, and I felt a click inside the wood. A tiny movement. The plug had worked its way out by a fraction of a millimeter. If it popped out, the chips would spill onto the snow right in front of the guards. It would be like a piñata of treason bursting open. I froze. I locked my knee, terrified to move. I spent the entire roll call, 40 minutes of torture in minus 30 degrees, balancing on my one good leg, trying to keep the prosthetic perfectly still. When I finally got back to the shed, I inspected the damage. The wood was warping from the moisture of the snow and the heat of the stove. The seal was failing. I needed a fix, and I didn't have wood glue. I had to use what I had. I melted down a piece of resin from a pine tree, mixing it with soot to color it black like the grime on the leg. I resealed the plug, essentially tarring it shut. But this meant I couldn't open it easily anymore. I could no longer add names every night. I had to change my system. I had to hoard the names in my head, memorize them, and then do a batch upload once a week when I could melt the seal. But the physical toll was getting worse. The prosthetic was heavy now, psychologically and physically. The stump of my leg, wrapped in dirty rags, began to chafe against the rim of the socket. The skin broke. A blister formed, then popped, then ulcerated. I knew the signs. Infection. In the Gulag, a leg infection meant amputation of the next segment. If I went to the infirmary, they would take my leg off to treat the stump. They would see the plug. They would find the archive. I made a choice. I would not go to the doctor. I would treat it myself. I heated my carving knife in the flame of the oil lamp until it glowed red. I bit down on a piece of leather. And there, in the solitude of the shed, I cut away the dead flesh of my own leg, cauterizing the wound with the hot steel. The pain was blinding. I passed out. But when I woke up, the leg was still there. The archive was safe. I had paid for the secret with a piece of my own meat. The day of the general's visit arrived. The camp was in a frenzy of whitewashing. The snow was swept. The prisoners were given clean shirts, which would be taken back the next day, and the kitchen actually smelled of meat. The commandant came to collect the tusk. It was finished. It was a masterpiece of deception. On the surface, it shone with the glory of the Soviet state. Trains, dams, smiling leaders. The commandant ran his hand over the smooth ivory, grinning like a child. "Magnificent," he whispered. "This will get me a promotion, Anatoly. Maybe I'll get transferred to Moscow. And you have earned your life." He took the tusk. I watched it go with a strange sense of loss. But I knew the real masterpiece wasn't the tusk. It was the wooden leg I was standing on. The inspection, however, wasn't over. The general, a fat man with medals weighing down his chest, wanted to see the artist. I was summoned to the main square. "This is the carver?" the general asked, looking down at me with disdain. I was filthy, smelling of soot and rotting leg despite my best efforts. "Yes, Comrade General," the commandant said, a cripple but golden hands. The general walked around me. He tapped my prosthetic leg with his cane. Thack, thack. "Wood?" he asked. Yes, Comrade General. Scavenged, I replied, my heart stopping. If he hit the hollow spot, if it sounded different. Resourceful, the general grunted. That is the Soviet spirit, making use of garbage. He laughed. The commandant laughed. I forced a smile. He was tapping on the graves of 300 men, calling it garbage. He didn't know that right beneath his cane was a list of his crimes. He turned away, bored. Give him an extra loaf of bread, and get him out of my sight. I hobbled away, sweat freezing on my back. I had survived the inspection, but the danger was evolving. The tusk was gone, which meant I no longer had a reason to be in the workshop alone. My special status was evaporating. I was just a cripple again. And a cripple with a bad leg is a burden. I knew the transfer lists were being drawn up for the winter. I had to be ready to move, and I had to take the library with me. The transfer order came 2 weeks later. I wasn't being sent to the execution garage, thank God, but I was being moved to a regime camp, a place with stricter discipline and harder labor. We were to be marched 10 miles to the railhead, then loaded onto cattle cars. The march was the test. A 10-mile walk in snow is hard for a healthy man. For a man with one leg and a festering stump, it is an odyssey. But I couldn't limp. If I lagged behind, the guards would shoot the stragglers. And worse, if I fell, the leg might break. I wrapped my stump in extra layers of stolen cloth. I tightened the straps of the prosthetic until they cut off the circulation. I had to become the machine. We marched. The wind was a solid wall of white. Left foot, wooden foot, left foot, wooden foot. The rhythm was my mantra. The pain in my stump was excruciating, a hot, throbbing agony that shot up my spine with every impact. But I focused on the names inside the wood. I visualized them. Ivanov, Petrov, Ginsburg. I was carrying them. If I fell, they were lost forever. I was their hearse. About 5 miles in, the man next to me, a young boy named Sasha, stumbled. He fell face first into the snow. A guard shouted, racking the slide of his rifle. "Get up!" Sasha tried, but his legs were gone. He looked at me, pleading. I stopped. I knew I shouldn't, but I grabbed Sasha's collar. "Up!" I hissed. "Lean on me." "You can't," he whispered. "Your leg." "My leg is stronger than you think," I said. I took his weight. Now I was carrying the dead inside the leg and the living on my shoulder. The wooden limb creaked. I heard it groan under the double load. Creak, thump, creak, thump. I was terrified the wood would split. I was terrified the plug would pop, but the wood held. The bone reinforcement held. We made it to the railhead. When we collapsed into the cattle car, I touched the leg. It was hot from the friction, but it was whole. The archive had survived the march. The new camp was a nightmare of searches. It was run by a commandant who was obsessed with contraband. Every week there was a schmon, a total shakedown. We were stripped naked and made to stand in the cold while they ripped apart our mattresses and checked our body cavities. The first time it happened, I thought it was the end. "Prosthetics off!" the guard shouted. There were 3 of us with false limbs in the barracks. We sat on the floor, unstrapping our legs. The guard picked up the first one, a simple peg leg. He looked at it, banged it against the floor to check for hollows, and threw it back. He picked up mine. He weighed it in his hands. It was heavy because of the bone density and the hundreds of chips inside. "Heavy," the guard muttered. "What's in this? Gold?" "Reinforced with mammoth bone, Citizen Chief," I said, my voice steady only because I had rehearsed this lie 1,000 times. "To keep it from snapping in the cold. Wood gets brittle." He shook it. Rattle. A faint, dull sound. The packing cloth had shifted. The guard froze. He brought the leg up to his ear. He shook it again. Click. "Something's loose," he said, his eyes narrowing. "The joint," I said quickly. "The screw is coming loose. I need to tighten it or I won't be able to work." He looked at me. He looked at the leg. He looked at the line of 50 naked, shivering men waiting behind me. He was bored. He was cold. He didn't want to dismantle a dirty, sweat-stained wooden leg to find a loose screw. "Fix it," he grunted, throwing the leg at me. It hit my chest hard. "If it breaks on the job, you crawl." I caught it. I strapped it on. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely work the buckles. That night, I spent 3 hours jamming more rags into the hollow space through a tiny crack, packing the silence back in. I realized I was living on borrowed time. The archive was getting too big, too noisy. I had to stop adding to it. The library was closed. Now, I just had to preserve it. Years passed. The death of Stalin in 1953 changed the world. The gulags began to open. The slow, bureaucratic process of rehabilitation began. I was old now. My hair was white, my hands were arthritic, and my good leg was weak. But I was still standing on the secret. My release date came in 1955. It was a surreal day. You don't feel joy. You feel a strange, hollow panic. The camp is the only world you know, but I had a mission. I had to get the leg out. The exit processing was thorough. They checked your papers. They checked your belongings. I had none. And they checked your person. I stood before the final gate. The officer looked at my release form. Anatoly V. Carver, one leg. He looked down. Is that camp property? He pointed to the prosthetic. I made it myself, I said. From scrap. Technically, the officer said, picking his teeth, anything made in the camp belongs to the state. We should confiscate it. He was joking. Or maybe he wasn't. It was the petty cruelty of the bureaucrat. If you take it, I said softly, I will have to crawl to the train station, and people will see a Soviet citizen crawling in the mud. It might look bad for the administration. The officer laughed. Get out of here, old man. Take your garbage leg. He stamped the paper. The gate opened. I walked out. I walked past the guard towers. I walked past the barbed wire. I walked onto the road that led to the station. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. I walked with the slow, deliberate rhythm of a man carrying a nuclear bomb. Thump, thump, thump. I didn't look back. I was free, and 200 names were free with me. I lived for another 20 years. I settled in a small town in the Urals, working as a watch repairman. I was a quiet neighbor. I drank tea, I listened to the radio, and I never spoke about Kolyma. People thought I was just another broken veteran of the war. I never took the leg off, except to sleep. I never opened the seal. I was terrified that even in freedom, the KGB was watching. The fear of the Gulag never leaves you. It sits in your bones. But in 1974, I got sick. Cancer. The doctor told me I had a few months. I knew it was time. I couldn't die with the secret still inside the wood. If they buried me with it, the wood would rot, and the names would be lost in the earth, just like the bodies. I wrote a letter to a woman in Moscow. Solzhenitsyn was already publishing underground, and there were groups collecting the history. I told them to come. When the young researcher arrived at my bedside, I pointed to the corner of the room. The leg was leaning there. I couldn't wear it anymore. I was too weak. Bring me the saw, I whispered. She looked confused, but she brought me my old tools. With shaking hands, I cut into the wood. I cut through the resin seal I had made 30 years ago. I pried open the plug. She gasped. Inside the hollow cavity, packed tight as sardines, were the bone chips, hundreds of them, yellowed, polished, covered in tiny, jagged scratches. I poured them out onto the bedsheet. They made a sound like rain. Click, clack, click. What is this? She asked, picking one up. Read it, I said. She squinted. Victor S. Teacher, 1949. She picked up another. Yuri K. Minor, 1951. She looked at me, tears filling her eyes. There are thousands. 1,243, I said. I counted them every step I took. I died a week later. They buried me with my good leg. The other leg, the bone leg, is in a museum now. They displayed the chips under glass lit by bright lights. People come and read the names. They see the tiny scratches made by a needle in the dark. They see the history that was meant to be erased. I survived the Gulag by carving secrets into my bone, but in the end, the bone didn't save me. It saved them, and that is enough. 106 Ta-Dao.